Edirne, Ottoman Empire. The 27th night of June, 1390. The chamber overlooks the palace gardens where jasmine blooms fill the evening air with fragrance so heavy it becomes almost narcotic. Silk cushions line the walls in shades of crimson and gold. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across geometric patterns that cover every surface. The room speaks of wealth beyond measure, of power that spans continents, of luxury that most people cannot imagine, even in dreams. A woman sits alone near the window. Her name is Olivera Lazarevich. She is 21 years old. 9 months ago, she was the daughter of the Prince of Serbia, promised in marriage to a Bosnian nobleman, living in a world where her future seemed secure, if not entirely her own. Tonight, she wears silks that cost more than her father's entire treasury. Gold threads through her hair. Jewels circle her wrists and throat. By every material measure, she exists in paradise. She has not spoken her native Serbian language to another human being in 4 months. The last person who understood her words was a servant girl from the Serbian territories, a woman who had been captured during the same campaign that brought Olivera to this chamber. That servant made the mistake of weeping while helping Olivera dress one morning. The Harem overseer discovered them speaking in hushed Serbian, sharing memories of churches and feast days and the particular quality of light through oak forests in autumn. The servant was transferred that same afternoon. Olivera never learned where. Since then, she has existed in linguistic isolation. She understands some Turkish now, enough to follow commands and basic conversation. But understanding is not the same as belonging. Every word she speaks in this borrowed language reminds her that her own tongue has become dangerous, something to be hidden, a marker of identity that must be suppressed. The door opens. She does not turn. She has learned the different footsteps, the quick, light steps of servants, the measured pace of the harem steward, the heavy, deliberate walk that means Sultan Bayezid himself approaches. These are his footsteps. He crosses the chamber without speaking. This is part of the pattern she has learned to recognize. Silence means he is pleased with something, some military victory or political negotiation. When he is angry, he arrives talking, filling the space with words that she must navigate carefully. Silence is preferable but not safe. Nothing here is safe. He stands beside her at the window, looking out at gardens that were designed by architects brought from Persia and maintained by gardeners captured from a dozen different territories. The Ottoman Empire is built on acquisition, land, resources, trade routes, cities, people. Everything can be acquired, catalogued, assigned function, integrated into the expanding system. Olivera is acquisition. She knows this with absolute clarity. She was transferred to Sultan Bayezid as part of the treaty arrangements that followed her father's death at Kosovo Polje. The Battle of Kosovo, where Serbian resistance to Ottoman expansion ended in blood and political calculation. Her father died on that field. Her people lost their independence on that field, and she became payment, tribute, living proof that the Ottomans had not simply defeated Serbia, but had consumed it so thoroughly that even the royal family's daughters could be redistributed according to the Sultan's preferences. "Your brother sent another letter," Bayezid says in Turkish. His voice is calm, almost casual. He continues to hope that diplomatic correspondence will somehow change circumstances that military force could not. Olivera's brother Stefan now rules what remains of Serbian territory as an Ottoman vassal. He sends letters that Olivera is not permitted to answer. The letters arrive through diplomatic channels. They are shown to her by harem officials who watch her face while she reads, measuring her reaction, assessing whether she retains emotional connections that might complicate her integration into Ottoman service. She has learned to show nothing. The letters break her heart. Stefan writes with desperate formality, trying to convey love and concern through language that will pass official review. He cannot say what he means. She cannot respond at all. The entire exchange is performance. Each letter another demonstration that her family's power has been completely subordinated to Ottoman authority. "He asks about your well-being," Bayezid continues. "He speaks as though discussing trade agreements. He hopes you are being treated with the dignity appropriate to your station." The question embedded in this statement is clear. What will she say? Will she confirm that she is well treated? Will she express gratitude? Will she demonstrate that she has accepted her circumstances and integrated into her assigned role? "I am well cared for," she says in careful Turkish. The words taste like copper. Bayezid nods. "This is the correct answer." He gestures to a servant who has been waiting near the door. The servant approaches with writing materials. Paper, ink, a pen cut from reed. "You will write to your brother," Bayezid instructs. "You will tell him that you are honored by the Sultan's attention, that you live in comfort beyond anything you knew in Serbia, that you have embraced your new position and hope that he will serve the Ottoman state with the same devotion you demonstrate daily." Each sentence is a knife. Olivera understands precisely what is being constructed. Her letter will be used as propaganda, circulated among the Serbian nobility to demonstrate the completeness of Ottoman victory. "Look," the letter will say, "even Princess Olivera, daughter of Prince Lazar who died fighting us, now writes with gratitude about her life in the Sultan's harem. Resistance is futile. Submission is the only rational choice." She takes the writing materials. Her hands do not shake. She has learned this too. But here is what makes this moment remarkable. This is not a unique cruelty invented specifically for Olivera Lazarevich. This is standard procedure. The Ottoman harem system, at its zenith, under sultans like Bayezid, operated with administrative sophistication that transformed captured women into political instruments with reliable efficiency. The luxury was real. The silk and jewels were genuine. The comfort was provided. And beneath all of it lay systematic destruction of previous identity, calculated isolation from support networks, and instrumental use of human beings as demonstrations of power. Tonight, you will discover how this system functioned, the specific methods used to break and rebuild identity, the political calculations that determined which captive women were assigned to which roles, the infrastructure that supported harems, containing dozens or hundreds of women, the decades-long impact on the women who survived, the ripple effects through families and kingdoms, and most importantly, the individual experience of women like Olivera who lived through systematic transformation while surrounded by wealth that made their captivity look like privilege. This is not romantic fantasy. This is documented political strategy. The sources exist in Ottoman administrative records, Serbian chronicles, Byzantine histories, and Venetian diplomatic reports. Multiple perspectives, all confirming the same essential system. The details are disturbing because they are true. Before we dive deep into this story, stay with it until the end. What happens to Olivera is something few would ever expect. Like the video, and subscribe to the channel to support a fellow history enthusiast, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'm always amazed by how far these stories reach. Now, let us return to Edirne in 1390, where Olivera Lazarevich writes the words that will change her life forever. The Battle of Kosovo took place on the 15th day of June, 1389, St. Vitus Day in the Christian calendar, a detail that would acquire mythological significance in Serbian memory. Prince Lazar Hrebelhanović led a coalition of Serbian, Bosnian, and other Balkan forces against Sultan Murad I and the advancing Ottoman army. The battle lasted from dawn until afternoon. Thousands died. Both Prince Lazar and Sultan Murad were killed during or immediately after the fighting. The battle's outcome was not a decisive military victory for either side. What made Kosovo transformative was what happened afterward. Prince Lazar's coalition fragmented. The Serbian nobility, facing an Ottoman army that had suffered losses but remained capable of further conquest, made calculations about survival. Within weeks, negotiations began. Within months, treaties were signed. Serbia became an Ottoman vassal state, maintaining nominal independence while accepting practical subordination. These treaties required more than promises of loyalty. They required tangible demonstrations of submission, tribute payments, military support for future Ottoman campaigns, trade concessions, and marriages. Political marriages had long served as tools of diplomacy throughout Europe and the Middle East. A daughter married to a rival's son could cement alliances, end conflicts, or create binding relationships between kingdoms. But Ottoman political marriages functioned differently. They were not alliances between equals. They were expressions of hierarchy, making visible the power relationship between conqueror and conquered. Olivera was 18 years old when the treaty negotiations began. She was Prince Lazar's daughter, which gave her value as a symbol. The Ottomans did not need her military support or her wealth. They needed what her presence in an Ottoman harem would represent: the complete subordination of Serbian nobility, the transformation of resistance leadership into tribute payment, the demonstration that even royal daughters could be redistributed according to Ottoman preferences. The actual transfer was documented in multiple sources. Serbian chronicles describe it as tragedy. Ottoman records describe it as diplomatic arrangement. Both agree on the essential facts. Olivera was given to Sultan Bayezid as part of the agreements that formalized Serbian vassal status. She was transported from Serbian territory to the Ottoman capital at Edirne. She entered the imperial harem in early 1390. To understand what this meant, you must first understand the Ottoman harem system itself. The harem was not a brothel. This is the first misconception to eliminate. It was a complex political and domestic institution that served multiple functions simultaneously. It housed the Sultan's family. It provided administrative support for the palace. It trained women for various roles within the Ottoman elite. It demonstrated the Sultan's power through the accumulation of women from conquered territories. And yes, it served sexual functions, but those functions were embedded in a much larger system of political control and social management. The Topkapi Palace harem, which would later become the most famous example, had not yet reached its full development in Bayezid's era, but the essential structures were already in place. The harem occupied a separate section of the palace complex. It had its own staff, its own hierarchy, its own regulations. Entry was controlled. Communication with the outside world was limited. Everything operated according to established procedures. At the top of the harem hierarchy sat the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She exercised enormous authority over the other women, managing the entire institution like a minister managing a government department. Below her ranked the Sultan's wives and favorites, each with their own status determined by factors including length of service, whether they had borne sons, and the Sultan's current favor. Below them came the concubines, women who might be called to the Sultan's attention or might spend their entire lives in waiting. And at the bottom labored the servants, women who performed domestic work and would never be considered for elevation to higher status. This hierarchy was ruthlessly enforced. Position determined everything: where you lived within the harem complex, what clothing you wore, how you were addressed, what access you had to the outside world through letters or visitors, whether you could hope for eventual freedom through manumission or would remain property until death. Olivera entered this system in an unusual position. She was not a purchased slave from the markets. She was not a captured commoner being processed through standard acquisition channels. She was Serbian royalty, transferred through diplomatic agreement. This gave her starting status above common concubines, but below established wives. She existed in an ambiguous middle position that created its own particular tensions. The other women in the harem understood what she represented. She was trophy, evidence that the Ottomans could take even the daughters of princes who had died fighting against them. Some of the women resented this, seeing her as receiving unearned privilege based solely on her origin. Others pitied her. understanding that her royal background made her captivity more psychologically complex than that of women who had been enslaved from birth and knew nothing else. Bayezid himself was 33 years old when Olivera entered his harem. He had earned his nickname the Thunderbolt through military campaigns prosecuted with stunning speed. He moved armies faster than his enemies anticipated. He struck before opponents could fully prepare. He expanded Ottoman territory in all directions simultaneously, fighting campaigns in Anatolia and the Balkans at the same time. This military genius extended to his understanding of political symbolism. Bayezid grasped that possessing Olivera sent messages to multiple audiences. To the Serbian nobility, it demonstrated their powerlessness. To other Balkan kingdoms, it showed what awaited resistance. To his own Ottoman elite, it proved his capacity to extract tribute from conquered peoples. To Europe, it revealed Ottoman power extending into Christian territories with such force that even royal daughters could be claimed as payment. The harem, from this perspective, was a political tool as much as a domestic arrangement. Each woman represented a conquest: Greek women from Byzantine territories, Bulgarian women from recently absorbed regions, Armenian women from the east, Serbian women from the north. The diversity was intentional. The harem was an empire in miniature, a display of Ottoman reach rendered in human form. But political tools are still human beings. The system operated through administrative efficiency, but it touched individual lives with devastating precision. Olivera was one woman in that system. Her story illuminates how systematic control functioned at the individual level. The first 60 days were systematic erasure. Olivera was assigned to chambers in the harem's newer wing, rooms that had been prepared specifically for her arrival. The luxury was immediate and overwhelming. Carpets from Persia covered every floor. Silk hangings softened the walls, cushions stuffed with down-provided seating. Low tables of carved walnut held vessels of gold and silver. The wealth concentrated in these rooms exceeded anything she had seen in her father's court. This was calculated. The luxury served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Ottoman superiority, showing that even their harem quarters surpassed Serbian royal accommodations. It created physical comfort that made resistance psychologically harder, and it complicated Olivera's own understanding of her situation. How could she be a prisoner when she lived in such magnificence? How could she claim suffering when surrounded by comforts that most people would never experience? An older woman arrived the morning after Olivera's placement. Her name was Huma, and she had served in the imperial harem for 23 years. She had entered as a captured teenager from Anatolian territories and had risen through the hierarchy to become an instructor, teaching new arrivals the skills and behaviors required for successful integration. Huma's first lesson addressed language. "You must speak only Turkish within the harem complex," she explained, in flawless Turkish with no trace of whatever language she had spoken before her own capture. "Serbian is forbidden. Your brother's language ends at the harem gates." Olivera started to respond in Serbian, an automatic reaction. Huma held up one hand, stopping her. "Turkish," Huma repeated. "Begin now. Every word in Serbian is a step backward. Every word in Turkish is progress toward acceptance." The linguistic isolation was deliberate. Language carries identity. Speaking Serbian would allow Olivera to maintain internal connection to her previous life. Speaking only Turkish forced her to inhabit the Ottoman world, even in her private thoughts. After weeks of exclusively Turkish conversation, she would find herself thinking in Turkish. Her dreams would shift languages. The transformation would occur at the deepest cognitive levels. But language was only the first component. Huma's instruction covered every aspect of presentation and behavior: how to walk within the harem, how to sit, how to lower her eyes, or meet someone's gaze, depending on their rank relative to hers, how to address the Valide Sultan with the proper combination of respect and formality, how to speak to other concubines without either condescension or excessive familiarity. "You are not a princess here," Huma explained. "That identity belongs to Serbian territory. In the harem, you are whatever the Sultan defines you as. Your function is determined by his assignment. Your status derives from his favor. Everything you were before you entered these walls is irrelevant except as it serves Ottoman purposes." The third week brought instruction in Ottoman court culture. Religious knowledge, poetry, music, conversation on topics that interested the educated Ottoman elite. Olivera learned the names of classical Arab poets. She studied Persian verse. She was taught to play the ney, the reed flute that featured in Ottoman chamber music. The education was sophisticated and thorough. This created psychological complexity. The instruction was genuinely enriching in some ways. Olivera learned things that expanded her intellectual horizons. The Ottoman court possessed cultural sophistication that exceeded Serbian noble culture in several respects. She was being educated in traditions of philosophy and art that were genuinely valuable. But the education served control. Each skill she acquired made her more useful to the system. Each bit of cultural knowledge made her better able to fulfill functions that the harem required. She was being refined, polished, transformed into a more valuable instrument. The fourth week introduced physical preparation. This was explained with the same clinical precision Huma applied to everything else. The harem maintained bathhouses with elaborate facilities for cleansing and grooming. Olivera learned the routines expected before any potential summons to the Sultan's chambers, the specific cleansing procedures, the perfumes and oils to be applied, the clothing to be worn, the timing of all preparations, so that she would be ready if called. "The Sultan expects perfection," Huma stated. "Not natural perfection, cultivated perfection. You will be prepared at all times. Your body is no longer your own concern. It is imperial property, to be maintained in optimal condition." This statement was delivered without emotion, a simple fact being communicated. Olivera's body had been transferred to Ottoman possession along with her person. Managing its presentation was now an administrative responsibility, no different from maintaining the palace buildings or keeping the gardens in proper order. The fifth week addressed the Sultan's expectations more explicitly. Huma described what would occur during nighttime summons, the procedures, the expected behaviors, the responses that demonstrated appropriate submission. She explained this in language that was technical rather than intimate, describing human interaction as though it were machinery requiring proper operation. "You do not refuse," Huma clarified. "Refusal is not a concept that exists in this context. You have been assigned to this function. The Sultan owns your service in all forms. Resistance damages you without affecting him. He will simply summon someone else, and you will face consequences for failed compliance." The consequences were not detailed. They did not need to be. Olivera had already observed the hierarchy. She understood that women who proved difficult could be demoted to servant status. She had seen the women who performed hard labor in the kitchens and laundries, women whose faces carried the exhaustion of endless work without hope of elevation. The message was clear. Comply with grace, or be reassigned to functions where grace was irrelevant. The sixth week brought interactions with other women in the harem. Until this point, Olivera had been kept relatively isolated during her training. Now she was integrated into the communal spaces where women gathered during daylight hours. She met the other concubines, the established wives, the servants. She learned the complex web of alliances and tensions that characterized the harem's social structure. One woman approached her during the afternoon, gathering in the main courtyard. Her name was Theodora, and she was Greek, captured during Ottoman expansion into Byzantine territories 5 years earlier. She had entered the harem through similar diplomatic transfer, a princess traded away by her family to secure favorable terms with the Ottomans. "You will hate yourself," Theodora said quietly, speaking Turkish with a precision that suggested it had replaced her native Greek almost entirely. "That is normal. The hating eventually becomes background noise. You learn to function despite it. Some days you even forget the hating for hours at a time. Then something reminds you and it all returns. This was the first acknowledgement Olivera had received that anyone else understood her experience. Huma's training had been clinical, the other staff had been formal. But Theodora spoke as someone who had lived through the same transformation and had survived by accepting psychological fragmentation as permanent condition. "Does it get easier?" Olivera asked. "No," Theodora answered. "You get stronger. That is not the same as easier." The 7th week marked Olivera's formal presentation to the Valide Sultan, Bayezid's mother. This was a ceremony of sorts, a ritualized acknowledgement that Olivera had completed basic training and was ready for potential assignment to active service. She was dressed in specially prepared silks. Her hair was arranged according to court fashion. She was instructed on the proper depth of her bow and the exact phrasing of her greeting. The Valide Sultan received her in a chamber hung with tapestries that depicted Ottoman military victories. The symbolism was not subtle. Olivera stood before Bayezid's mother, surrounded by images of the conquest that had led to her presence in this palace. The Valide Sultan studied her with eyes that revealed decades of experience managing the harem's complex politics. "You understand your function?" she asked. "Yes, Valide Sultan," Olivera responded in Turkish. "You will bring honor to this household through perfect compliance. You will demonstrate to your brother and your people that Serbian nobility recognizes Ottoman authority as supreme. You will serve as living proof that resistance is futile and submission is rewarded with comfort. These are your purposes. Do you accept them?" The question was formality. Acceptance was not optional, but the formality mattered. By forcing Olivera to verbally accept her assigned purposes, the system transformed her captivity into something she had theoretically chosen. This was psychological manipulation of sophisticated precision. "I accept," Olivera said. The 8th week brought the inevitability she had been preparing for. She was summoned to Sultan Bayezid's private chambers. If you're still listening, comment number 1 below to let me know you're here. Like the video and subscribe to the channel to show me your support if you haven't already. Now let's continue. The summons arrived at sunset. A eunuch appeared at Olivera's chambers with the formal notification. The Sultan requested her presence after the evening prayer. She had 3 hours to prepare. The preparation followed the routines Huma had drilled into her. The bathhouse, the oils and perfumes, the specific clothing. Her hands moved through the procedures with mechanical precision, while her mind existed somewhere else, watching from a distance, observing without feeling. Theodora appeared during the preparation, offering assistance that was also solidarity. She helped arrange Olivera's hair in the prescribed style. She applied kohl to Olivera's eyes with expert precision. She worked in silence, both women understanding that words would make this harder. When the preparation was complete, Olivera looked at her reflection in the polished bronze mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable. She wore Ottoman silks. She had Ottoman cosmetics enhancing her features. Her hair was arranged in Ottoman fashion. She looked like she belonged in this palace, like she had been born to this life. The transformation was complete. Olivera Lazarevich, daughter of Prince Lazar, who died fighting the Ottomans at Kosovo, no longer existed in any visible way. What remained was a woman who would perform the function she had been assigned, because all other options had been systematically eliminated. The eunuch returned. It was time. The walk to the Sultan's chambers took only minutes, but felt endless. They passed through corridors lit by oil lamps. Guards stood at intervals, their presence a reminder of the absolute control exercised over every aspect of palace life. No one entered these sections without authorization. No one left without the same. The door to Bayezid's chambers was carved walnut inlaid with ivory, beautiful and intimidating simultaneously. The eunuch knocked once, received acknowledgement from within, and gestured for Olivera to enter. The chamber was smaller than she had anticipated, more intimate. A large bed dominated one wall. Cushions surrounded a low table where food had been laid out. Lamps cast warm light that created an illusion of coziness. Everything had been designed to seem comfortable even welcoming. Bayezid sat near the window holding a book. He looked up as she entered and gestured to the cushions near the table. "Sit," he instructed. "We will eat first." This surprised her. She had expected immediate physical demands. Instead, he was offering food, suggesting conversation. The humanity of it made everything harder. If he had been purely brutal, she could have hated cleanly. But this civilized veneer, this pretense of normalcy, complicated her emotional response. They ate. He asked her questions about her education in Serbia, what she had studied, what languages she spoke, whether she had learned music. The questions were genuinely curious. He listened to her answers with attention that suggested he actually cared about her responses. This was power demonstrating itself. He could afford to be curious about her previous life because that life posed no threat to him. He could ask about her father's court because that court no longer existed as an independent entity. He could engage with her as a person because her personhood was entirely under his control. When the meal finished, he stood and moved toward the bed. The transition was abrupt. The conversation ended. The function shifted. Olivera rose and followed, moving with the practiced motions Huma had taught her, performing compliance because refusal was not an option that existed in this carefully constructed system. What occurred over the next hours was violation rendered comfortable through silk sheets and gentle touch. This is the hardest truth to articulate. There was no overt violence, no brutality. Bayezid was not cruel in the way that casual observers might recognize cruelty. He simply exercised absolute ownership over a woman who could not refuse, could not leave, could not determine any aspect of her own physical existence. Olivera employed the dissociation techniques she had developed during training. She separated her consciousness from her body. She observed herself from a removed perspective. She made her mind think about other things, the geometric patterns on the ceiling, the sound of wind through the palace gardens, anything except the physical reality occurring in this carefully appointed chamber. When it ended, Bayezid dismissed her with courtesy that was almost worse than cruelty. "You performed well," he said. Huma's training was effective. She was evaluated, assessed for performance, reduced to a function that had been judged adequate. The eunuch waited outside to escort her back to her chambers. The walk back covered the same corridors, but felt entirely different. She had been transformed again. She was no longer a woman anticipating what would happen. She was a woman who had experienced it and would experience it again, summoned whenever the Sultan's preferences dictated. Theodora waited in Olivera's chambers. She had prepared a bath. She helped Olivera wash, removing the oils and perfumes, cleansing away the physical evidence. She wrapped her in soft cotton and sat with her while Olivera stared at nothing. "The first time is the hardest," Theodora offered. "Not because it gets better, because after the first time, you know exactly what to expect. The unknown element is gone. You just have to survive the knowing." Olivera said nothing. There was nothing to say. 3 months later, Serbian ambassadors arrived in Edirne for treaty negotiations. The Ottoman Empire was demanding increased tribute from Serbian territories. Stefan Lazarevich, Olivera's brother, sent his representatives to negotiate terms that might be sustainable without completely destroying the Serbian economy. Bayezid received the ambassadors in the main throne room with full ceremonial protocol. He sat on a raised platform beneath banners displaying Ottoman insignia. Military commanders flanked him on both sides. The message was clear before anyone spoke. The Ottomans held absolute power. These negotiations were not between equals. What happened next was calculated political theater. Bayezid ordered the Harem women to attend the audience. This was unusual. Harem members typically remained secluded within their own sections of the palace complex. Bringing them to a diplomatic gathering violated normal protocol. The violation was intentional. Olivera was dressed in her finest silks. Gold jewelry adorned her wrists and throat. Her hair was arranged with elaborate precision. She looked like a woman of immense privilege, like someone who had not merely adapted to harem life, but had embraced it. She was positioned where the Serbian ambassadors would see her immediately upon entering the throne room. The placement was strategic. She was display, evidence, living proof of Ottoman dominance. The ambassadors entered and froze when they recognized her. One of them had been her father's advisor before Kosovo. Another had served in the Serbian court when she was a child. They knew exactly who she was. They understood exactly what her presence in this gathering meant. Bayezid allowed them to see her for a full minute before speaking. The silence was weapon. Then he gestured casually toward Olivera as though she were simply another piece of palace decoration. "Your princess finds life in the Ottoman court quite agreeable," he stated. "She has adapted remarkably to her new circumstances. Perhaps this demonstrates the wisdom of cooperation with Ottoman authority." The ambassadors were forced to respond, to acknowledge her presence, to participate in the political theater even as it destroyed them. One of them bowed in Olivera's direction. Another looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with the visible proof of Serbian subordination. Olivera stood perfectly still. She had been instructed on her behavior during this audience. She was to smile, to appear content, to demonstrate through every visible signal that she was happy, that she had accepted her position, that resistance was futile, and submission led to comfortable circumstances. She smiled. The expression felt like it was cracking her face, but she smiled. The negotiations proceeded with Olivera remaining present throughout. Every treaty discussion occurred under her gaze. Every concession the Serbian ambassadors made was witnessed by the daughter of their dead prince. The psychological impact was devastating and deliberately cultivated. When the audience concluded, Bayezid dismissed everyone except his closest advisors. Olivera was returned to the harem by her usual escorts. But the damage had been done. The Serbian ambassadors returned home carrying the image of Princess Olivera, smiling in Ottoman silks. They would report to Stefan what they had seen. The message would spread through Serbian nobility. Resistance was pointless. Even their princess had been converted into an instrument of Ottoman authority. Olivera returned to her chambers and sat motionless for hours. Theodora found her still sitting as darkness fell, staring at her reflection in the bronze mirror. "They made you perform," Theodora observed. "I smiled at them," Olivera said, her voice hollow. "I smiled at men who knew my father, who served our family. I stood there in silk and jewels and smiled while the Sultan used me to break their spirits." "That is what we are," Theodora replied. "That is the function. We are not companions. We are not wives in any meaningful sense. We are weapons. Political weapons deployed to demonstrate Ottoman power over the territories we came from." The understanding settled into Olivera's consciousness with terrible clarity. This was her purpose. This was why she was maintained in luxury and trained with such care. She was instrument of psychological warfare. Her captivity served functions far beyond the Sultan's personal gratification. She was message to all of Serbia, all of the Balkans, all of Christian Europe. This is what happens when you resist us. We take even your princesses. We dress them in silk. We make them smile. The horror was not in physical brutality. The horror was in systematic transformation into something that destroyed her people every time she appeared in public, every time she smiled on command, every time she demonstrated the completeness of her integration into the system that had consumed her homeland. Stefan Lazarevich wrote monthly. The letters arrived through diplomatic channels and were reviewed by Ottoman officials before being shown to Olivera. She was permitted to read them, but not to respond privately. Any correspondence she sent went through official review and approval. The letters contained careful language that attempted to convey love while passing censorship. Stefan wrote about Serbian territories, about harvest yields, about minor administrative matters. Between the lines, Olivera could read his desperation. He was trying to reach her, trying to maintain connection, trying to tell her that she had not been forgotten. But the system intercepted even this. When Olivera was permitted to write responses, she was required to compose them under supervision. A scribe sat beside her, recording what she wrote. The Valide Sultan reviewed drafts before allowing them to be sent. Every word was scrutinized for signs of resistance or coded messages. Olivera's letters therefore became exercises in careful performance. She wrote about her comfortable circumstances. She mentioned the beauty of the palace gardens. She described cultural events she attended. She thanked Stefan for his concern and assured him she was well treated. She never wrote what she meant. I am captive. I am instrument. I am being used to demonstrate your powerlessness. Please know that when I write that I am happy, I am lying. Please know that I have not forgotten who I was. These true messages existed only in her mind. What appeared on paper was propaganda that the Ottomans then circulated among Balkan nobility. Look, the letters said, even Princess Olivera acknowledges the benefits of cooperation with the empire. One letter from Stefan arrived in the autumn of 1392, 2 years after Olivera's transfer. The language was formal, as always, but one paragraph stood out. Stefan wrote about a church in Belgrade that was being restored. He described the iconography being painted on the walls. He mentioned specifically that one icon depicted Saint Vitus, the saint honored on the day of the Kosovo battle. Olivera understood. Stefan was telling her that Kosovo had not been forgotten. That Serbian identity persisted despite Ottoman domination. That some forms of resistance continued even if they could not be openly expressed. The message gave her something she had not felt in 2 years. Hope. Not hope for rescue. That was impossible. But hope that somewhere beyond these palace walls, people remembered. That her captivity meant something beyond her individual suffering. That she was not entirely alone. She wrote back carefully. In her response, she mentioned that the palace complex contained beautiful mosaics. She described their geometric patterns in detail, then added one sentence about how certain patterns reminded her of church windows she had seen as a child. The sentence passed review because it seemed innocuous. But Stefan would understand. She was telling him that she still carried Serbian memories. That transformation had not been complete. That some part of her resisted even if outwardly she complied. This became their method. Coded messages hidden in mundane descriptions. Neither could speak directly. Neither could express what they truly meant. But through careful construction, they maintained a thread of connection that the Ottoman system could not entirely sever. The correspondence continued for years, letter after letter, each one performing compliance while hiding tiny resistances in the subtext. Olivera became expert at this double language. Her official letters praised Ottoman culture and expressed gratitude for her treatment. Her coded messages, visible only to someone who knew how to read them, maintained her essential identity. But the double existence extracted psychological cost. Every letter required her to be 2 people simultaneously. The compliant harem member writing praise. The Serbian princess embedding resistance in subtext. The effort of maintaining both identities, without letting either completely overwhelm the other, required constant vigilance. Theodora observed this struggle with recognition born of her own similar experience. You are learning the art of internal exile, she told Olivera. You keep some small part of yourself hidden where they cannot reach it. You feed that hidden part with tiny resistances that they do not detect. It is how you survive with your sanity somewhat intact. Does the hidden part ever get larger? Olivera asked. Does it ever grow strong enough to reclaim the rest? No, Theodora answered. It just stays hidden. A small, protected space that proves you still exist underneath all the performance. That has to be enough, because it is all you get. Time in the harem was measured in summons. Olivera was called to Bayezid's chambers with irregular frequency. Sometimes weeks passed between summons. Sometimes she was called multiple nights in succession. The unpredictability was part of the control mechanism. She could never relax entirely. She had to remain prepared constantly. Between summons, life followed repetitive patterns, morning prayers, breakfast in the communal areas, afternoons spent in various activities, embroidery, music practice, conversation with other women, evenings in her own chambers or attending gatherings if the Sultan was entertaining. The routine was comfortable in a numbing way. Other women came and went through the harem during these years. New captives arrived from different territories as Ottoman expansion continued. Some women were elevated through bearing sons. Others were demoted for failing to meet expectations. The population was fluid, constantly changing, a reminder that individuals were replaceable within the system. Olivera developed relationships with some of the other women. Not quite friendships, because true friendship requires mutual vulnerability, and no one in the harem could afford complete vulnerability. But alliances, shared understanding, the recognition that they were all caught in the same structure and might as well show each other small kindnesses when opportunities arose. A Hungarian woman named Ilona entered the harem in 1394. She had been captured during raids into Hungarian territory and had remarkable musical ability. She played the tambour with skill that impressed even the jaded palace musicians. She was marked for potential elevation if she performed well during her initial period. Olivera helped train Ilona in the same way Theodora had helped her, teaching her the unwritten rules, explaining the political dynamics, preparing her for the inevitable summons. The instruction created complicated feelings. Olivera was perpetuating the system by helping new women adapt to it. But refusing to help would leave them more vulnerable, more likely to make mistakes that resulted in punishment. There were no good choices. "How long have you been here?" Ilona asked one evening while they practiced musical pieces together. 4 years, Olivera answered, though sometimes it feels like forever. Other times it feels like my previous life ended yesterday, and all of this is still temporary shock that will eventually fade. Does it fade? No. You just get used to the shock. It becomes your normal. That is almost worse than if it had stayed sharp and painful. The adaptation feels like betrayal of your former self. Ilona absorbed this in silence. Then she asked the question that all new arrivals eventually asked. "Is there any escape?" "Death or manumission," Olivera said. Manumission is rare, and usually granted only to women who are too old to serve the functions they were acquired for. Death is common. Disease, childbirth, despair. The harem population turns over every decade or so through attrition. Those who remain longest are those who learn to survive without hope. That is bleak. That is honest. The women who tell you hopeful stories are either deluded or cruel. I prefer to be honest. This became Olivera's role within the harem hierarchy, the honest one. The woman who told new arrivals the truth without sugarcoating. Some women appreciated this. Others found it too harsh. Olivera did not particularly care about their approval. She had discovered that minor rebellion, tiny exercises of autonomy even within the system's constraints, helped maintain her sense of self. Being brutally honest when asked direct questions was one such rebellion. She could not escape. She could not refuse the Sultan's summons. She could not correspond freely with her brother. But she could choose to tell other captive women the unvarnished truth about their circumstances. The choice was microscopic but real. The years accumulated: 1395, 1396, 1397. Olivera marked time by external events rather than internal experience. Ottoman campaigns against new territories, diplomatic visits from European powers, changes in palace administration. Her own life had become so repetitive that using it to measure time seemed pointless. She was 28 in 1397. She had spent 7 years in the harem. She had been summoned to Bayezid's chambers perhaps 200 times. She had trained dozens of new arrivals. She had watched women elevated and demoted and die. She had written countless letters to Stefan performing compliance while embedding tiny resistances. She had survived. That was the sum total of her achievement. Survival without hope, without joy, without anything except the daily performance of required functions. In 1398, a new woman entered the harem who would shift all existing dynamics. Her name was Hafsa, and she was Circassian, brought to the palace through slave markets rather than diplomatic transfer. She was 18 years old and possessed beauty that was remarkable, even in a harem full of carefully selected women. Bayezid became immediately infatuated. Hafsa was summoned to his chambers 3 times in her first week, 5 times in her second week. By the end of her first month, she was clearly established as the new favorite. Women who had held higher positions suddenly found themselves eclipsed. This shift created tensions throughout the harem. The previous favorites resented displacement. The established wives felt threatened by the intensity of Bayezid's attention to this new concubine. The entire hierarchy destabilized as everyone recalculated their positions relative to Hafsa's meteoric rise. Olivera watched this with detached interest. She had no investment in being favorite. The attention brought more frequent summons, which she did not want. Let Hafsa bear that burden. But the political implications were complex. Women in favor had more influence. They could advocate for others or destroy enemies. They could shift the internal power dynamics of the harem through a word to the Sultan. Hafsa proved adept at harem politics. Within 3 months, she had built a faction of supporters, women who believed aligning with the new favorite would protect their own positions. She used her access to Bayezid to advocate for her allies and subtly undermine potential rivals. One afternoon, Hafsa approached Olivera in the garden courtyard. "I have heard you give honest counsel to new arrivals," she said. "I wonder if you might offer me your honest assessment of something." Olivera was immediately wary. Hafsa had no need of her counsel. This was a test of some kind. "I am happy to offer what limited wisdom I have. You have been here 8 years, Hafsa continued. You know the patterns. You understand the systems. Do you believe the Sultan values honesty or compliance more highly?" The question was trap. Answer honesty, and Hafsa might use it to position herself as a woman who challenged the Sultan intellectually. Answer compliance, and she might use it to justify increased submission that would cement her position. Either answer could be weaponized. "I believe the Sultan values different qualities in different women at different times," Olivera said carefully. "What he seeks from a political captive like myself is different from what he seeks from a purchased concubine like yourself. There is no universal answer." Hafsa smiled. "That itself is an honest answer. Thank you." She departed, leaving Olivera uncertain what had just occurred. Was it genuinely a request for advice? Or was it testing whether Olivera might pose a threat to Hafsa's position? 3 days later, Olivera discovered which. Hafsa had spoken to Bayezid about Olivera's melancholy disposition. She suggested that perhaps Olivera had never fully adapted to harem life. Perhaps she maintained inappropriate attachment to her Serbian identity. Perhaps this represented subtle resistance that should be addressed. The accusations were dangerous. If Bayezid believed Olivera had not truly submitted, she could be demoted, or worse. The fact that the accusations came from the current favorite gave them weight they would not otherwise possess. Olivera was summoned to the Valide Sultan's chambers. Bayezid's mother questioned her directly about her loyalty, her compliance, her acceptance of her position. Olivera responded with perfect performances of submission, citing her 8 years of service without incident, her training of new arrivals, her regular attendance at all required functions. The Valide Sultan studied her for a long moment. "Hafsa sees you as rival," she finally said. "Not for the Sultan's attention. You are too old for that now, but for influence within the harem. She believes you maintain too much independent identity, that your honesty with new arrivals undermines the system by teaching them to view their circumstances with excessive clarity." "I teach them to survive," Olivera responded. "Survival requires understanding reality. I provide that understanding." And that is precisely what Hafsa finds threatening. She prefers women who do not understand reality quite so clearly, who remain hopeful that compliance will be rewarded, who maintain illusions that make them more malleable. "What would you have me do?" "Nothing," the Valide Sultan said. "Hafsa is young. She will learn that not all women can be managed the same way. You perform your functions adequately, and you serve useful purposes in training others. I will not demote you based on the jealousy of a girl who has been here 3 months." Olivera was dismissed. The immediate threat had passed. But the interaction revealed how precarious all positions in the harem remained. One word from a favorite could destroy carefully maintained status. No amount of service guaranteed security. The system operated through constant uncertainty that kept everyone vigilant and compliant. Hafsa's position lasted another year before Bayezid's attention shifted again. This was the pattern. Intense fascination followed by gradual cooling. The favorite of this year became merely another concubine next year. The cycle repeated endlessly, keeping all women in a state of competition for attention that many of them did not actually want, but needed for self-preservation. Olivera observed this with the weary understanding that comes from years inside any closed system. She knew the patterns. She could predict the trajectories. She had seen enough favorites rise and fall to recognize the signs of impending shift in the Sultan's preferences. This knowledge was its own burden. She could see disasters approaching but could not prevent them. She could identify which women were making strategic errors but could not warn them without creating new complications. She existed in a state of hyper-aware powerlessness, understanding everything while being able to affect nothing. While Olivera navigated harem politics, Bayezid prosecuted military campaigns across multiple frontiers. The Ottoman Empire expanded aggressively in all directions. By the turn of the century, Bayezid controlled territories from the Danube to Anatolia. His military genius remained undiminished. His nickname remained apt. The thunderbolt struck wherever resistance emerged. But in 1402, he encountered an enemy who moved even faster than he did. Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who had built an empire stretching from Delhi to Damascus, turned his attention westward. The two empires collided at the Battle of Ankara. News of the battle reached the harem in fragments. First reports suggested Ottoman victory. Then corrections arrived. Confusion, contradictory accounts. Finally, devastating truth. Bayezid had been defeated, captured. The Ottoman army had been shattered. The harem descended into panic. If Bayezid was captured, what happened to his household? Would Timur's forces attack Edirne? Would the women be seized as spoils? The uncertainty was paralyzing. Olivera sat in her chambers while chaos erupted around her. Other women wept or prayed or attempted to gather valuables for potential flight. Olivera felt strange calm. After 12 years of captivity, the prospect of new captivity held no particular terror. What was one conqueror compared to another? What was one harem compared to another? But rescue did not arrive. Neither did Timur's armies. Instead, Bayezid's sons began fighting each other for succession. The Ottoman Empire fragmented into civil war. The harem remained in Edirne, maintained by administrators who continued operating the system, even as the political structure above them collapsed into chaos. This revealed something fundamental about the Ottoman system. It was not dependent on individual sultans. It was institutional. The bureaucrats continued managing the harem according to established procedures, regardless of who held power. The women remained captive, not because Bayezid personally enforced their captivity, but because an entire structure surrounded them that would continue functioning even if he died. Bayezid did die in 1403, still in Timur's captivity. His death should have created opportunity for change. Instead, it simply meant the women waited in uncertainty while his sons fought over inheritance. Eventually, one son emerged victorious. Mehmed the first established control and claimed his father's territories. He also claimed his father's household. The harem women were transferred to his authority as part of the imperial inheritance. For Olivera, this meant a new sultan but the same basic situation. She was now part of Mehmed's harem, though at 34 years old she was no longer of particular interest to a younger sultan who had his own preferences. She existed in semi-retirement, still maintained within the harem system but no longer regularly summoned. This was strange relief. She remained captive, but her most despised function had ended. She spent her days in relative peace, training new arrivals, managing minor administrative tasks. existing in the background of harem life. Stefan continued writing. His letters now came through different diplomatic channels but carried the same coded messages. Kosovo was remembered. Serbian identity persisted. She was not forgotten. She wrote back with the same careful double language, performing compliance, embedding resistance in subtext, maintaining the thread of connection across political chaos and geographical distance. The Ottoman harem system that held Olivera was not unique aberration. It was sophisticated expression of a pattern that repeated throughout history wherever conquest created opportunities for systematic control of captured populations. Understanding how it functioned reveals uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the infrastructure required to maintain systems of oppression. The harem served multiple simultaneous functions within Ottoman political structure. It was domestic institution, managing the Sultan's family and household. It was political tool, displaying Ottoman power through the accumulation of women from conquered territories. It was administrative center, training women for various roles within the elite. And it was psychological weapon, demonstrating the completeness of conquest by transforming even the daughters of enemy princes into Ottoman instruments. This multiplicity of function made the system remarkably resilient. If one function lost importance, others remained. If domestic arrangements changed, political displays continued. If individual sultans cared less about some aspects, administrators maintained operations according to established procedures. The system transcended any individual's preferences because it served so many purposes simultaneously. The economic structure supporting the harem was vast. Hundreds of servants, elaborate facilities, constant acquisition of luxury goods, food, clothing, jewelry, cosmetics, musical instruments, books. The expenditure was enormous. But the return on investment was calculated in political terms rather than economic ones. The harem demonstrated Ottoman wealth and power. It provided reward system for loyal service. It created networks of obligation and patronage. The economic cost was justified by political returns. The legal framework legitimizing the harem derived from Islamic jurisprudence regarding slavery and concubinage. These legal traditions predated the Ottomans and would persist beyond them. But Ottoman administrators developed particularly sophisticated interpretations that maximized their capacity to acquire and control women from diverse sources. Diplomatic transfer, like Olivera's situation, occupied a legal gray area. She was not exactly a slave purchased in open market. She was tribute, human payment offered by a defeated power to a victorious one. The distinction mattered legally, but made little practical difference in her daily experience. Whether acquired through diplomacy or purchase, she existed under total Ottoman authority with no legal recourse or protection. The psychological techniques employed to break and rebuild identity were refined over centuries of practice. Linguistic isolation, physical luxury that complicated self-understanding, training that provided genuine skills while serving control, constant surveillance, punishment through demotion rather than overt violence, reward through elevation within the hierarchy. All of these techniques worked together to transform captured women into functioning components of the Ottoman system. The system succeeded by making resistance psychologically untenable. Physical resistance was impossible due to guards and locked doors, but psychological resistance was undermined through more subtle means. The luxury made it difficult to claim victimhood. The cultural education made it difficult to reject all aspects of Ottoman civilization. The relationships with other women created incentives to maintain position rather than risk demotion. The tiny privileges granted for good behavior created investment in compliance. Women like Olivera, who maintained internal resistance despite outward compliance, survived through sophisticated psychological compartmentalization. They created hidden selves that performed required functions while protecting some core identity from complete transformation. This required enormous mental energy and created permanent fractures in self-conception. But it was better than the alternative, which was total surrender of identity to the system. The generational effects extended far beyond individual women's lifetimes. Children born to harem women, like Anna in the previous script's generational story, carried complex identities that merged their mother's origins with Ottoman culture. Over time, this created a distinctive Ottoman elite culture that was genuinely multicultural, but built on foundations of systematic capture and transformation. The genetic legacy is measurable today. Population studies show significant mixing of Balkan, Caucasian, and Anatolian genetic markers in modern Turkish populations. Much of this mixing occurred through mechanisms like the harem system. Every woman who bore children within the system contributed to permanent population change. Their DNA persists centuries after the institutions that captured them have disappeared. The erasure of these stories from popular history serves multiple purposes. It allows romantic fantasies about exotic harems to replace honest examination of systematic control. It lets modern nations avoid confronting uncomfortable aspects of their imperial pasts. It prevents difficult questions about how sophisticated societies enable institutional oppression through legal frameworks and administrative procedure. But the documentary evidence exists. Ottoman archives contain detailed records. Serbian chronicles preserve perspectives from the conquered populations. Byzantine historians documented what they observed. Venetian diplomatic reports provide external verification. Multiple independent sources confirm the same basic system. Recent scholarship has begun examining this evidence more honestly. Feminist historians have challenged romanticized narratives. Post-colonial analysis has revealed the political functions of institutions like the harem. Social historians have reconstructed the lived experiences of women like Olivera through careful reading of available sources. The picture that emerges is complex and disturbing. The Ottoman harem was simultaneously brutal in its control and sophisticated in its operation. It destroyed individual autonomy while providing genuine material comfort. It was violent in its systematic transformation of identity while avoiding overt physical cruelty in most cases. These apparent contradictions reveal the nature of systematic oppression, which rarely resembles the simple violence that casual observers expect. Olivera Lazarevich lived in the Ottoman harem for 32 years. She entered at age 21 and remained until her death at age 53 in 1421. She never returned to Serbian territory. She never married by choice. She never controlled the basic parameters of her own existence. But she survived. And in surviving, she maintained some essential core of identity that the system could not completely destroy. Her letters to Stefan, examined by modern historians, reveal the sophistication of her coded resistance. She wrote in Turkish about Ottoman culture, while embedding references to Serbian saints, Serbian feast days, Serbian cultural touchstones in ways that passed official review but communicated her persistent identity to her brother. When she died, she was buried according to Muslim rites in Edirne, but Stefan arranged for a memorial in Serbia that bore her Christian name and described her as a princess who had endured exile with dignity. The dual commemoration reflected her dual existence. Ottoman records remember her as Despina Hatun, a respected member of the imperial household. Serbian records remember her as Olivera Lazarevich, a martyr to Ottoman conquest who maintained her identity despite systematic attempts at transformation. Both are true. She was both people simultaneously. That was her burden and her achievement. The other women, whose stories intersected with hers, followed various trajectories. Theodora died in childbirth at age 38. Ilona was manumitted at age 52 and lived her final years in quiet obscurity. Hafsa remained a favorite until age obscured her beauty, then served as instructor for newer arrivals. Each woman navigated the system in her own way, finding whatever tiny spaces for autonomy existed within the rigid structure. The system itself continued for centuries after Olivera's death. The Ottoman harem reached its peak elaboration in the 16th century under Suleiman the Magnificent. It persisted until the early 20th century when the empire collapsed and the harem was finally disbanded. Thousands of women passed through it across those centuries. Most of their names are lost. Most of their stories were never recorded. They exist as statistical entries in administrative documents, numbers rather than individuals. But Olivera's story survived because of her royal origin and because her brother preserved memory of her. She represents the thousands of unnamed women who experienced similar captivity. Her documented suffering illuminates their undocumented experiences. What happened to Olivera and women like her was systematic violence rendered comfortable through silk and administrative procedure. It was conquest made personal. It was political domination inscribed on individual bodies. It was power demonstrating itself through total control over those least able to resist. Understanding this matters because the patterns did not end with the Ottoman Empire. The specific institution of the harem is gone, but the underlying dynamics that enabled it persist. The use of women as political instruments, the systematic control of captured populations through institutions that make oppression routine, the administrative efficiency that distributes responsibility so thoroughly that no individual participant must confront the full horror of their participation. These patterns repeat throughout history in different forms. Recognizing them requires looking past the specific cultural expressions to the underlying structures. The Ottoman harem, the Atlantic slave trade, the systematic violations that occur during ethnic conflict, the trafficking networks that operate today, all involve variations on the same themes: acquisition, transformation, control. Instrumental use of human beings, according to systematic procedures that make horror routine. Olivera's story forces confrontation with these patterns. She cannot be dismissed as victim of a distant, incomprehensible past. She was educated, resourceful, psychologically sophisticated. She maintained coded resistance for decades. She survived with her essential identity somewhat intact despite everything the system did to destroy it. Her strength makes her suffering more visible, not less. She demonstrates what systematic oppression looks like when imposed on someone fully capable of understanding and resisting it. Her captivity lasted 3 decades. For perspective, that is longer than many people's entire adult lives. She spent her 20s, 30s, and 40s in that silk-lined prison. She never experienced adult life outside of captivity. She never made free choices about where to live, whom to associate with, how to spend her time, what to do with her body. Every moment of every day was determined by a system that had classified her as instrument and assigned her functions accordingly. The comfort was real. The silk, the jewelry, the gardens, the cultural sophistication, all genuine. But comfort under total control is not freedom. Luxury without autonomy is not privilege. She understood this with painful clarity, as evidenced by her letters. She knew that observers might look at her material circumstances and fail to grasp her captivity. She knew that the system's sophistication made her suffering invisible to casual examination. This knowledge was its own burden. We return now to that evening in 1390, when Olivera sat in her chamber, writing letters on command, choosing words carefully to satisfy censors while embedding tiny resistances in subtext. She wrote sentences praising Ottoman culture while her hands trembled with suppressed rage. She composed paragraphs expressing gratitude while her mind screamed the truth that could never appear on paper. She was captive. She was instrument. She was living proof that even royal daughters could be transformed into tools of the empire that destroyed their families. And she survived that evening, and the next evening, and the thousands of evenings that followed across 32 years of captivity. She survived by fragmenting herself into the compliance she performed and the resistance she protected in hidden internal spaces. She survived by finding microscopic autonomies within systematic control. She survived by maintaining connection to her brother through coded letters. She survived by helping other captured women navigate the same impossible circumstances. Her survival was not triumph. It was simply survival. But that meant something. It meant the system failed to completely break her. It meant some essential core of Olivera Lazarevich persisted, despite Despina Hatun's perfect performance of compliance. It meant that even systematic oppression implemented by one of history's most sophisticated empires could not entirely eliminate human resistance. That is cold comfort. It does not redeem the horror. It does not justify the system. It does not make any of it acceptable. But it matters. It proves that humans can maintain identity even under conditions designed to destroy it. It demonstrates that tiny resistances accumulate, meaning even when they cannot achieve practical change. It shows that victims of systematic oppression are not passive, but actively engaged in the impossible task of maintaining humanity under conditions that deny it. Remember Olivera Lazarevich, daughter of Prince Lazar, Serbian princess, captive for 32 years, dead at 53, buried in Edirne under an Ottoman name, commemorated in Serbia under her Christian name, both and neither, destroyed and resistant, broken and surviving. Remember all the women like her whose names were not preserved, whose letters were never coded, whose brothers could not maintain connection, whose survival left no trace in historical records. They existed. Their suffering was real. The system that consumed them operated with administrative efficiency and legal sanction. Forgetting them allows the comfortable fiction that such systematic horror belonged only to the distant past. Remembering them requires acknowledging that the capacity for systematic oppression remains part of what human societies can construct when they combine organizational competence with moral permission and institutional structure. That capacity did not end with the Ottoman Empire. It persists wherever power creates systems that transform human beings into instruments. If you found this examination worthwhile, if you believe these stories matter, if you think historical honesty serves purpose beyond comfortable fantasy, hit subscribe. Comment with your location because understanding how these systems operated requires knowing their geographical extent. And stay for future videos where we will continue examining the historical realities that official narratives prefer to obscure. These voices deserve to be heard. Olivera Lazarevich deserves to be remembered not as exotic harem tale, but as human being who endured systematic captivity for 32 years, while maintaining fragments of identity that the system tried to erase. Her story is not entertainment. It is memorial. It is documentation. It is evidence that must be preserved against the erasure that benefits powerful institutions and comfortable narratives. Remember her name. Remember what was done to her. Remember that it was systematic, calculated, legally sanctioned, and enabled by thousands of ordinary people performing their assigned functions without confronting the cumulative horror their participation created. That is the lesson. Not that the past was uniquely terrible, but that systematic horror requires systematic structure, and that recognizing those structures remains essential because they continue emerging in new forms whenever power seeks total control over those who cannot effectively resist. Remember,